Hi, my name is Josué. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology. I spent this academic year doing fieldwork in El Salvador, and during this presentation, I'm going to talk about that research and what motivated it. The title of this presentation is Are They Indians? Land Tenure and Indigeneity in an Autonomous Community in El Salvador. And throughout this presentation, basically, I'll make the point that Salvadorans preserve their indigenous identity through the kind of subsistence and land tenure customs that they protect. So El Salvador is a small country, about the size of the state of Massachusetts in Central America. It borders Guatemala and Honduras. El Salvador has Pacific Ocean, which makes it a country for surfers to visit, but it doesn't have any Caribbean Sea, and it's the only Central American country without Caribbean Sea. It's one of the countries of the Northern Triangle. El Salvador is broken up into several departments, and the department where I did my field work is called Santa Ana, the Santa Ana department. The capital of that department is also the city is also called Santa Ana. And I was on a lake called Lake Weija in the Santa Ana department. And the lake borders Guatemala, so it has a Guatemalan side and a Salvadoran side. The background of my project. So when I started my PhD program, I was a student of Guatemala, I was a student of Quiché Maya, and I was a student of Guatemalan indigeneity. And during the course of my PhD program, I became interested in not the characteristics that portray indigenous resilience, but in erasure, in the disappearance of indigeneity in certain places. And I thought, well, that El Salvador would be a good country to contrast with the work that I had done in Guatemala. On this slide, I have two images, and the one on the right is in Chichicastenango in the Western Highlands of Guatemala, and one can see that that the women specifically are wearing indigenous clothing that they make in their municipios and that represent their municipios. If you're in Guatemala, one hears Mayan languages spoken all around you. One hears Quiché and Cachiquel and Canjobal. In El Salvador, you don't have these perceivable markers of indigeneity. So at this market, you don't see the textile industry operative in Guatemala is not operative here. People in El Salvador don't speak their indigenous languages, at least not from my experience. I didn't hear Nawa being spoken or Maya Pocomam or something like that. And this was a point of interest for me because El Salvador used to be part of Guatemala, and the countries are very nearby one another. So why is this so different? And that got me into scholarship or a body of literature around what some scholars have called the myth of the vanishing Indian. And I found out that in El Salvador, there's this prominent myth that in 1932, this is when indigenous people disappeared. There's this precise date, and the story goes like this. In 1932, there was an insurrection, widespread campesino and working class insurrection. And the military response or the governmental response to this was that the military dictatorship, whose leader was Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez, ordered soldiers to crush the revolt and to target anybody wearing indigenous clothing or speaking indigenous languages. And this is the story that's commonly thought in El Salvador. Deeper historical analysis shows that there's complex factors that went into the disappearance of indigeneity in El Salvador. And one of those complex factors was the adoption by the ruling classes of classical liberal philosophy and the implementation of classical liberal economics. One of the policies that was passed was the enclosure of land and the transformation of land from collectively owned and collectively managed estates that were called ejidos during the colonial era and that were called calpui during pre-Columbian times, and the institution of individualistic landholding. So on this poster from the Museo de la Palabra y la Imagen, there is a quote that says, "The enclosure of land was not beneficial for indigenous people who had to give up communal land tenure and adopt individualist landholding." So my argument is that Salvadorans from 1932 to the armed conflict of the 1980s are constantly, one of their demands is for agrarian reform. This is one of the indigenous memories that they really value. This is my field site. Lago de Huija, like I said, it straddles the Guatemalan and Salvadoran border. I arrived at Lago de Huija in July, and I arrived to a hamlet called La Barra de Huija. And the point of picking this field site was to see how this broader national Salvadoran history dovetailed with the local history that I would learn about at my field site. So I arrived at La Barra de Huija and I started to meet community members there. I recruited 12 research participants. 6 of those research participants are members of the cooperative called ISTA, the Salvadoran Institute of Agrarian Transformation. And I asked them if I could interview them about their life history. And what I really wanted to know about was what was life like growing up. And they all told me this story about, and there were some differences in the way that the stories were told, but they were all basically the same story that in the 1960s, the land that they have, that they collectively manage and on which and on which they organize their cooperatives, used to be privately owned land, owned by one single landlord. There was one hacendado. This family was the Posada family. And the people living in the hamlet where I stay, they're actually from an island from inside of the lake. They weren't allowed during the 1960s or any time prior to that to plant crops, to move freely throughout that area because the lands were private and the landowners' guards would target them and kick them off their lands, or some kind of altercation would come from that. So the people used to live on La Barra de Huija. I have an image of that, where they would live primarily from fishing and small gardens. And in the 1970s, alongside popular movements and popular organizations around El Salvador, the peasants connected with agencies and organizations in San Salvador, and they struggle to expropriate the land from the landowner. And they were successful. That over 500 acres of land were distributed to the campesinos. The campesinos got plots of land. The government helped them build houses there. And without all of the research participants discussed that their life improved dramatically from the 1960s, when they didn't have this, when the landowner was in charge of things there, till today and afterwards, where people can farm their land so long as they follow the cooperative's stipulations about how the land is to be used. And so here I have images of what life is like today. Large cornfields. There are coconut orchards. A boy is drawing maize. And I participated in monthly cooperative meetings, and I saw how the cooperative is democratically run, how people participate and get to elect new council members. So here in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a secretary, a president, and a treasurer being sworn in. So there's a change of power. And to me, I think that at Lago de Huija, while you don't see the characteristics of indigeneity that we're used to, like languages, like land, like clothing, or necessarily religious things, religious pre-Columbian tradition, what you do see is this preservation and appreciation of collective land tenure. And that is basically the premise of my research. I have more images here of fishing and That is it. If you have any more, if you have any questions about my research or want to reach out, this is my email address, and I am in the Department of Anthropology. And thank you so much for participating and for listening. Thank you.